Hello there, and if you're watching on YouTube, hey, you can see my face, and if you're listening on the podcast, well, you can hear my so wonderful voice, I suppose. This episode is going to be on the equation of failure plus reflection equaling success and learning, or rather, learning and then going into success. I thought I'd start it off with a personal anecdotal story of mine that actually led to me doing this video in the first place in a roundabout way. Actually, quite a direct way in a way. Um, when I was graduating from my bachelor's in nutrition and dietetics from Acadia, I did not have a placement lined up, an internship rather, if you will. And without that internship, you can't become a full-fledged dietitian. You're very limited, even though you have the degree and all the learnings. You don't have the component that it's outside of the school, though. Without the hundreds of hours you need to accumulate, you can't be a dietitian here in Canada, in most provinces anyway. And so I did not secure one of those in that last year of school, which was incredibly stressful and was an incredible setback for me. I remember practicing so much for interviews and, for years making sure I had good grades, doing several interviews with no success. And then when finally my last interview that I'd done got back to me and said, yeah, no, you haven't been selected, and classmates around me were getting their placements and being quite successful and moving ahead in life essentially. And I was looking at the future and thinking to myself, my God, I'm now quite stagnating. Like, my life plan of getting out into the workforce and helping people, this is, it was a huge setback because the new interviews didn't go out until the next fall. So I had to wait not only 5 or 6 months to reapply to some of these, but also waiting another 4 or 5 months after that to get the internship. And then so it was really good to just delay my whole life plan by about a year, maybe even a year and a half. And I was looking at that and I was so anxious. And this was the spring of 2020. I was graduating, and COVID had been rolling pretty hard right now. There's lockdowns, the end of the world was upon us, and that was quite stressful. But it was also a time to reflect on this setback. And for those of you who've watched the channel before, what really first sparked my interest in becoming a counselor was this course I took in my last semester called Critical Nutrition Counseling, where it was a small group of us. It was just an elective course, so there 7 or 8 of us plus the professor, and we just read a book on Buddhism and life and death and some of the conversations we would have with certain clients who might be at the end of their life. We didn't talk about food at all, just about the human condition, human experiences, big emotions, and kind of how to handle that. And that really piqued my interest. And so in this stage after graduating, and I'm reflecting on, do I continue to bolster my resume and pursue dietetics and to become a dietitian? Or what do I do here? What am I willing to do? What do I want to do? What direction do I want? Why do I want these things? Are they achievable? What's the time frame for that achievement? All these thoughts were swirling in my head, and ultimately I ended up deciding towards the end of that summer or into the fall of 2020 that I would pursue counseling. At the end of, it was 6 or 7 months of thought, really. And I pursued a job, and I knew to get into a master's of counseling, I had to have relevant work experience in the field because I didn't have a degree in psychology. And even though for masters, as long as you have somewhat of an adjacent degree, it's normally you're normally pretty okay. But they really value also, especially if you don't have a relevant bachelor's work experience. So I knew one of the first things I had to do was get a job in the helping field, and so I pursued that and did that. At the same time, and because of COVID, actually, the Vancouver Community College had gone fully online. And so even though I was in Nova Scotia, I was able to take several upgrade credits in the basics of counseling psychology and just psychology in general to bolster my resume to get into school. And that took, I think, a year and a half or 2 years, and then I finally got in. And when I got in, well, here we are today. Here is, I went through the school, and I couldn't be happier with that decision. And it's night and day, the emotions I felt. It's over 5 years ago now. When I graduated, I felt that my life was so stagnated and I was so behind, and my parents would be disappointed. My friends were gonna kind of get ahead of me, and to the point where I'd be almost left behind, and all these fears were present. But then I just, after that reflection, pursued exactly what I wanted to do, and ended up in a spot where I wouldn't change a single thing, and I'm so happy for it. And so I think that's just an example. And at the time, it's true though, at the time, those emotions were very heavy. They really sucked. I had several sleepless nights. It wasn't a lot of fun, but through it all, there's not a single thing I would change. That those painful emotions forced some degree of reflection and what on earth are you doing with your life? And it was painful to contemplate it, but at the end of the day, it brought me to where I am here today, and I'll be forever grateful for not getting one of those internships. Actually, I think if anything, I would have delayed. I think I always would have become a counselor, but I would have delayed it much more. I probably would have worked for several years. Maybe would have gotten caught in maybe a mortgage, and maybe it would have been much more difficult to shift careers while trying to pay that off. Who knows what could have happened? And so I'm so grateful for the way that these setbacks affected my life. But with that said, let's get into it. So yes, our equation here, and not to quantify the human experience, but failure plus reflection equals progress, or learnings, or steps to success. And so in an ideal world, you are flagging the minefield as you go about life. You're proactively reflecting on decisions to be made, or looking to maintain a certain quality of life or output, or like work output, social output, what have you, and looking for ways in which you could prepare for these things and lessen the impact as they arise, or avoid the setback altogether. And so this could also be called forethought rather than proactive reflection. But sometimes, despite our best intentions, we are blind to the obstacles that lay before us, or are unable to avoid certain setbacks and stagnations. So what do you do when you do have a setback, a stagnation, or an outright failure? Well, first, it's identifying the fact that that has happened to you. You've been hindered in some way in your progress towards a goal, and that hindrance has varying levels of degrees of intensity and severity. It could be as small as a couple weeks go by that you're hindered, or it could be multiple years of mistakes, or rather correcting these mistakes, or at least building back the momentum to get back to the point where you were. And then, so what do you do when you have one of these failures? Do you stop everything and concede, and that goal isn't for me? Well, I don't think, if you're listening and if you have a goal, you'll really be satisfied with that answer. Many people in life end up regretting the things that they didn't do and the things they didn't pursue, rather than the things that they did out of whether it was easier, or because they just gave up and didn't see something through to the end. It's a very common thing, a very common statement older people make towards the end of their life. So what's a productive way to experience or to address these failures and setbacks? Well, that is through reflection. So you can do exercises like journaling, and we'll get into some of the questions here in a sec. Like journaling, um, you can sit down with yourself and think for a little bit, and just take, no phones, no distractions, nobody else around, unless they're there specifically for that purpose, perhaps, and bouncing ideas back, like a counselor like myself. Um, have fun with it though when you're doing it. Excuse me. Go take yourself on a walk to your favorite park, your favorite beach, what have you, and maybe get a nice coffee, or your favorite drink or your favorite snack, and relax and sit down and have a nice conversation with yourself. Um, Sometimes it's helpful to contain these instances of reflection, where as there's a very fine line between productive reflection and unhelpful and unproductive rumination, where it's constantly on your mind and it's just cycling the same thoughts over and over and over again. There's a very fine line between the two, but really I would say that the difference would be, one leaves you feeling somewhat lighter and that you've addressed these concerns, whereas the other one, and you can kind of go with it and then go about your day and focus on something else, whether it's socializing or your work or what have you. Whereas when it becomes unproductive is when these thoughts, what am I going to do with my life, interject while you're at work or right before bed, and they're very emotionally disruptive, and lessen your sleep quality, decrease your work performance. Maybe you're not yourself when you're socializing because these things are just constantly on your mind. That's when it really becomes unproductive. And then lastly, after these reflections, it's so important to take action, not to just get stuck in trying to craft the perfect answer and the perfect plan, and a plan for every single potential outcome. How am I going to be thinking a year from now? How am I going to be thinking 20 years from now about this decision? Maybe a year from now, and maybe in saying that, it's good to have some of those thoughts, but to try and forecast accurately how you will be feeling in 20 years. Well, all you need to do to see the ridiculousness of that is to think back to 20 years ago in your life and how you envisioned your life to be. And if it's exactly like how you envisioned it, that is, that's something to be proud of. Really, you're good at forecasting. But there's so many things that can change. Our personalities can change over time, our interests, our values of what we want out of life, the people around us. All these things are very variable. And so not getting stuck on the reflecting part too long, that's also key. And then, once you've reflected enough, now it's time to achieve some progress, or go out there and test some of these strategies. Test your reflections against reality and against yourself. And those learnings and the successes or steps to success is the name of the game here. Challenges change, and so too are the adaptations and strategies that you'll use at each step of the way. So in my example, when I was contemplating, I never planned, I planned for years to be a dietitian, and I never planned once to become a counselor. That was something I never planned for, even though I think, again, in reflecting on it, it was there all along. But these things, I had to adjust my strategy of the entire career I was working. I had to go into a field where, and work some jobs where I didn't mind these jobs, but I didn't really prefer them, and would not have planned for that. But it was the reality of the situation, and it was something that I was willing to do, which is important. We'll kind of get to that. And so, a strategy of mine had to change of, what jobs I was willing to take on. Instead of working so many hours at the restaurant that I was doing through college, And after I graduated and I was kind of in this slump, I was like, I'll just, the money's pretty good for what I'm doing. I guess I'll just work here for the next year as I figure things out. But very quickly after I reflected, I'm like, okay, I'll stay on here for a bit. But instead of working full time, like I was hard to do, I switched to part time so I could have time for this other job. And so you can see, just as you change and time progresses and your values change and you reflect on who you are, your strategies and your adaptations to these new learnings will just naturally change. You'll feel this urge, trusting your gut's a part of it too, and just trusting yourself and your ability to know yourself. But so, what are some good reflective questions to ask yourself as you encounter these failures or setbacks, you might be asking? So, our first one is, what went undesirably? Was it something that I did? Was it in those interviews I didn't prep for my interviews well enough? Did I not volunteer enough? Did I not get good enough grades? Was it something that the other person did? Was it something that another person did? So perhaps maybe somebody outcompeted me for these roles, which is what happened. And no harm, no foul. That's all, more the better to them. Is it something that was environmental? Was it was the place that I interviewed at, they thought they could take on 3 interview students, and but then at the last minute, the person that was the supervisor to all of us maybe was pregnant or had an injury or surgery or moved towns or what have you, and now their new replacement only felt comfortable taking on one new clinician, and so the environment of the hospital could only, I suppose that's a bit with another person, but the environment of the hospital or like the dietetic clinic or what have you could only have the capacity for one student at that time. So what went undesirably for you, and kind of pinpointing the failure point is really what we're getting at, or multiple failure points. What happened that was a pleasant surprise in this situation? So, alluding back to my example, I learned after that much thought and reflection that, okay, I need to, and this was more towards the beginning rather. More towards the beginning, and this is how my mind shifted as I reflected. More towards the beginning, I remember thinking, okay, I've identified, I probably didn't have the strongest of interviews. I did not have very good interview skills. What can I do to prepare for that in the future? So that was a bit of a pleasant surprise. Okay, now I have something to do, something that I can control and influence. I learned that, through talking to other classmates about the placements that they got and what was expected of them at some of these placements, that, okay, I'm actually kind of glad I didn't get into some of those, because it sounded pretty grueling, and it wasn't even that much dietetic work. It was almost more administrative stuff. It wasn't a whole lot of what I would consider valuable learnings, really. It was just customer support, essentially, and paper pushing. So if you look closely enough, there's often some pleasant surprises, and those can come from learnings about yourself or learnings about the situation that at the start you might easily look over or gloss over. Come the end of my period of time before I decided my next steps, it was I was alluding back to what I've just said. I was so happy that I didn't get it or any of these internships, because it really, through that process, I was able to look back and say, hey, I want to be a counselor, and I want to talk to people on a wide variety of subjects and hopefully help them have a better quality of life. So sometimes, there can be pleasantries inside of failure as well, and setback. What can I do personally to influence this situation? Is another important question. Like, what's within my sphere of control and influence? I can upgrade my resume through volunteering, through learning better interview skills, through taking some courses. These are things that are that were on my mind at this point in time. These are things that I can control. What I can't control is how many internship places get opened up in the fall coming up. I can't control how many people are going to be applying to those, whether, some years the class size at Acadia would be, I want to say 40 to 60 students. And or it can really range anywhere from like 40 to 60 or 70 or 80, give or take. And, when there's 40, it's obvious to see that you have a better chance at getting an internship. Whereas if there's 80 people applying, your chances by rights or by numbers almost are cut in half. So I can't control how many people get into the program and how many people are applying. I can't control where some of those internships are, and if I'm, I might not be willing to go drive 3 hours to the south shore of Nova Scotia and move down there for a year, or buy a second vehicle and do that. So these things are somewhat out of my control. Or well, buying the car and moving are within my control, but where the placements are and whether or not that's desirable to me and something I'm willing to do, we'll get to. That's a component of it. And but by focusing on what you can control and everything else, it's easier said than done, but letting the other things, although they might be inconvenient or not as preferable as you'd like, if you can't control them or influence them in any way, it's better use of your energy and your mental stamina and your mood to focus on what you can control in some of these situations. And just reflect on that, asking this question: what can I control? I can still go to the gym. I can still eat well as I go through time, and keep my mental energy up, keep my stamina up, so I can continue to handle these stressful situations a little bit better than if not. I'm even though going to the gym technically has nothing to do with, I wouldn't be putting that on my resume, but perhaps it gives me the stamina or the discipline to continue to reach out or to handle further failures of applying to different jobs in the meantime, what have you. There's lots of examples I could speak to, but in the interest of time, we'll keep going. So the next question, we've kind of already addressed this, but what is beyond my control? And we've already addressed that one. Just things that are beyond your control suck your energy out. And while it's still important to consider them for what they are and to be aware of them, because if you're aware of some, they can sometimes by being aware of what's not in your control, it can highlight or help highlight what is within your control. So how could I do things differently next time? So, once you've identified, what went undesirably, what happened that was pleasant or positive in that whole experience, how are you going to do things differently, or if at all? Maybe some of these pleasant surprises lead you to, maybe you got feedback from one interviewer saying, and this didn't actually happen, but just like an anecdote or a made up example. But perhaps some of your interviewers said that they appreciated that you arrived 10 minutes early and you were dressed appropriately, and because of that and because of other things, you were in the final cuts of these interview processes. So maybe you don't want to do that aspect of it differently, but maybe being quicker on your feet or preparing better, preparing answers to various questions or the structure of your answers a bit better might be something that you want to do differently. But as I was asking myself these types of questions, how could I do things differently? This thought began coming into my head. Well, what am I doing here? What do I want to be a dietitian? After I've done a full degree, I have a good idea about what being a dietitian is. Is this something I want? Is this a path I want to continue down? And sometimes people can get caught in the sunk cost fallacy. It's just a mental trap where if you've invested a given amount of time or energy or something down a road, it can seem like a complete and utter waste of all that time and energy to just either halt, going down that path and backtrack, or carve a different path in a different direction. But it's one of those things where, is it better to say to yourself, okay, I've made the wrong choice in hindsight now, for the past couple of years, than to stick to something and almost be a slave to your past self's ambition, and then live through that life that your past self set up for you, and do something that your current self is just not really, it's not your preference? Is that not also a poor investment of your time and energy? Something to ponder. So as you're asking yourself, like, what things can I do differently, and more importantly, onto that, these are the skills that you're willing to, try and work on, the connections you might be trying to make. Maybe it's, volunteering at the very hospital that you want to get an internship at, and trying to get your foot in the door, meet the manager who's doing all that, or the supervisor, and doing some of these actions, or upgrading a skill set, if like skills, networking, behaviors, all these things. What are you going to do differently as you go through this process of reflection, and finding answers to these. And it takes time. All these questions, you could spend days and weeks and even months pondering these questions, and sometimes it's good to take a lot of time, especially for big decisions where you're spending lots of money and time and energy, and trying to find a direction for that. But again, there's a fine line between planning it all out and then taking decisive action, and when the rubber hits the road of reality. So as you're kind of thinking, what could I do, or what ought I to do differently to improve my chances next time of not having a failure? And more importantly, onto that, what are you willing to do differently? There might be certain skills that you have no passion for, no curiosity, no interest, but it's a part of the profession. And now, whether that falls into the basket of things that, I love this profession, and if I have to learn this thing just to get my foot in the door, so be it. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. It's gonna affect my emotions. It's gonna be kind of a bit of a grind, kind of grueling work to get through it, but I'm willing to at the end of the day. But there might be things where the answer is I am not willing to do that. Perhaps it's being willing to drive down 3 hours or move somewhere for a year or two to do the internship, and be available there. And you're not willing to do that. You're not willing to live there. Maybe the weather is poor in that part of the province. You don't know anybody. Maybe you don't even have a car, so once you get down there and you're renting down there, you can only leave every now and then if your parents come visit you and bring you somewhere in your car. Suppose you could bus, but things like this, like what are you willing to do differently, is just as important, if not more important, than the things that you can do differently. And so lastly here, it's, why is it important to you or to me to keep going down this path? This is something, you can talk about your values, what you want out of a profession, out of a decision, out of a relationship, acquiring an item. Like, is it still important to you to get that TV or that new car. You know, in that old Nietzsche quote, or rather Viktor Frankl quote, you know, a man or woman who has a reason why can endure anyhow. It's very applicable to your life. I encourage you to look at your reasons why you do certain things, and especially the things that are begrudging to you or inconvenient or uncomfortable. You know, pushing through those emotions and continuing on in the face of these negative emotions and thoughts. If you have a strong enough why you want to do it, you know, I really want to help people live a better quality of life. I think there's too much suffering and discontentment out there that doesn't have to exist. There's no reason, there's no law of the universe that says it has to exist. And so I want to help people do that. So I will, you know, I'll move across the province, I'll go to school, I'll go into enormous debt to do these things and to pursue my passion in life. These are all, if you can answer these questions and sit down with yourself and really ponder them. It's funny, my school ring, my Acadia school ring, I have the word ponder engraved on it. I like thinking about things and reflecting. It's you know, that's why I'm a counselor. It's fun to think about life and how do things work, how do people work, how does one interact with something else. You know, and it's helpful to reflect, not just hit a failure, not adjust your strategy at all, and then expect a different result. That's what's that Einstein quote? Was it you know, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result every time is the definition of insanity. You know, we're kind of bumping up against that quote here with this, if you don't include reflection in your failures and your new attempts. So some tips to help along the way. So, you know, at each stage of this. So initially and right after a failure or setback, it can be very helpful to externalize the problem. The problem is the problem. You are not the problem. I might be very bad at interviews. I get nervous. I want to answer the questions perfectly every time and not say a single word out of place. And it's something that actually, these YouTube videos sometimes help a lot with that. I just let my mind go, and if I make some mistakes, it is what it is. But I'm sure the version of myself from 5 years ago would be thinking, what is that guy doing? But I digress. So, you know, if you are not the problem is the problem. So, you know, your interview skills being insufficient is the problem, not that you are a, you know, less than desirable individual. Maybe your time management is the problem, but that does not mean that you are a incompetent person in a wide variety of aspects of your life. The class or the maybe you're applying to a job and it's very popular, and so you're gonna be competing with hundreds of people for a very desirable job versus a job that's 70% desirable to you, and you know there's only 5 applicants. You know, the problem of this large pool of competition is the problem, not and standing out amongst that crowd is the problem, not that you are somehow worth less than any one members of those applicants. So yeah, not getting too bogged down in your character and degrading your character and such. That just does nothing but exemplify some of these emotions that can be circling around right after a failure, really demoralizing. You know, if you are somebody who is just unsuccessful at obtaining a goal, you know, and you're blanketing yourself with that, with the slogan of unsuccessful person wholeheartedly, Well, do you think you're going to be more or less likely or more or less motivated to pursue a different strategy? If you're just, if everything you do, oh, I'm an unsuccessful person, I'm a lazy person, I'm poor with time management, so might as well not even try, these types of things. So externalize the problem. The problem is the problem. You are not the problem. During the reflection stage, and it's similarly aligned with this, but take out self-defeating and self-deprecating words from your conversation with yourself. Be kind to yourself as if you were talking to a friend or partner. This shows up whether it's failures or setbacks of all sorts. Even if you're just going about the day, talking to yourself in your mind. Some of the stuff we say to ourselves is just terrible, and we would never say it to a loved one or a friend or a coworker, even someone on the street that you didn't much care for at all. Besides, they're basically they're a citizen in the town that I live in, and treat them with that baseline of respect. We are our own worst critics, and so if you notice yourself saying just hurtful words, things that take away from it, try and limit that in your conversations with yourself as you're reflecting. What went undesirably. Well, I'm a lazy, useless person because I missed the time to go to the interview because I didn't get up early enough because I stayed up late. I'm irresponsible. And I suppose maybe some harsher language than that, but I think you know what I mean. And then on taking action here. So if you're getting caught up in the action phase after you've been reflecting and you're afraid to make another mistake perhaps, something you can do is purposely make a mistake, a small, insignificant one. It's called paradoxical intention, and it's an intervention that's used in counseling. But how it might work is, if you're just crippled by anxiety of the unknownness of the, where is the next mistake or failure point coming from, and that fear is stopping you from approaching a new situation, going out into the unknown, even just a small step. Make a small mistake and see what happens. Does the world end? Does your life crumple apart? It could be as simple as, and some of these are pretty silly, what we can come up with, but, pouring water into your cereal, and, I'll never condone food waste, but pour water into your cereal instead of milk. Oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. And it's purposeful though. You do it on purpose, and you're doing it. Maybe cleaning the house and missing a spot on the floor purposefully. Could be that one. It could be doing all your laundry but not drying the pillowcases, and maybe this one would be a bit extreme, but go to bed with a wet pillow. Kind of some silly simple things where you consciously make a mistake, you suffer the consequences of the mistake, and hopefully you kind of realize that, hey, look, mistakes are a part of life, and setbacks and failures, these things happen frequently, if not every day, and they're not the end of the world, and you can handle the stress that comes with them. Many things, our next step is, and it's still on taking action, but many things require managing multiple moving pieces all at once, especially for big, important goals, like, identifying a career, or, planning a very extravagant trip. Some of these things, your education, what have you, maybe building a house or deciding to move, just deciding to move. Where are we moving? Where can we afford? Am I going to have a car there? Is it close to public transit? Is it within walking distance of a grocery store, a gym? a way to get out into nature. Is there nature nearby? All these things. There can be decisions to be made and things to look at. So with all these moving pieces as part of a goal, if you're struggling with motivation to get started out on pursuing that or figuring it out, or just don't know where to start, so write down all the things you have to do as if they were a menu at your favorite restaurant. Simple tasks like, maybe researching neighborhoods of an area where you'd want to live, or just the broader area. Vancouver, for instance, is a big area. Okay, what's in Burnaby? What's in Port Moody? What's in Tsawwassen or Ladner? What do each of these places look like? What do they have in terms of amenities or infrastructure? Start to identify some of these places. So like simple tasks like that, they might be appetizers for you on your menu. Difficult tasks could be the expensive entrees. So, deciding between, sending in, you've identified a few places and now you have to formally write up some rental applications, and each one of those is going to take you half an hour to an hour, and it might even come with some sort of deposit or something, a $500 deposit while they assess your application, or maybe even like $100 application fee. So it's a bit more of a commitment financially, time-wise. It's pretty far down the decision framework, and you have to be fairly confident, hopefully, that if any one of these ping back and say, yeah, you're good to go, that you've made a good choice. That aspect of it might be a expensive entree and so forth. So pick something from the menu that matches your energy level and actually do it. And if you have to do it uncomfortably, inconveniently, do it. There's you have this goal in mind, and I would allude back to the question of why are you doing these things in the first place? If you're confronting or being confounded by a lack of motivation, understanding why you're doing it in the first place is very helpful. And perhaps you might even get down to a certain point and realize, there's no way I want to live in North Vancouver. It's the expenses, it lists all these tick boxes, but it's just too expensive. I'll be too stressed financially, even after months of thought. I'm not doing that. I'm going to move elsewhere. That's somewhat similar but more affordable. Or maybe you decide on a different place altogether, but you're reflecting. But you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know to ask yourself these types of questions if you didn't then take the steps on this menu, or however you want to organize it, to then trigger your mind to say, let's have a second thought at it. If you don't get past the first reflection phase, you're not going to get to this stage where you're taking actions. You're doing research, you're calling rental companies or what have you, and then maybe things change after 2 or 3 weeks of that, and a place that was number 3 on your list, the managers or the resident coordinator or resident manager, what have you, is so kind there, and they're responsive, they're quick, and you decide, you know what, and that actually, I'd want to live somewhere where I know that the resident manager is on top of things, that responds promptly, is very friendly. They're the friendliest one out of all of them, and I would value that actually more than these other two. But you would never know that if you didn't reach out to these places. And so that's basically where the end of this episode is. And in closing here, the single biggest contributor to you stopping from reaching your goal is giving up on yourself. And the odds of giving up increase dramatically during those instances where you encounter these setbacks or failures and you're flush with the emotions of regret, sadness, anger, guilt, and blaming others or the world or yourself. These are, you're most likely to just say, oh, screw it all, I'll just stay put, and the discomfort of my current state is worth more than the discomfort of putting it out there on the table again and risking feel this way again into the future. But you are responsible for your life. You are the one that directs your life in the direction you desire at the end of the day. Nobody else is going to do it for you. It's your responsibility. You have to get back on the reins, even if it's uncomfortable, and you're traversing unknown territory, and you don't know where the next failure point or the next landmine is going to be. You gotta keep going on, because the only other option is to stay where you are, I suppose. And it doesn't have to be immediate. Like this reflection process takes time. But to just give up after a point of failure, you are not going to attain your goal. Maybe you will attain your goal. It'll be a much slower process, I imagine, than if you take proactive and well thought out steps to do so. And so, whether or not you have to build the momentum back piece by piece, and it might take you months or a year or two to get back to the place that you just failed from. Sometimes it might only take a couple weeks, or put your head down, and in 3 months you're right back to on a pace of progression that you're satisfied with a direction in mind, a North Star guiding you. But the biggest thing is building that momentum back, getting back on the reins. And so start small. Start with some of those appetizers. Start reflecting, and then get doing some of those actions and behaviors and activities. And in a few weeks or months, you'll very likely thank yourself for doing it then and not later. But in saying that, everybody needs their time to process, especially certain setbacks. And so these things tend to come somewhat naturally. You'll naturally begin thinking, okay, what am I going to do now? I'm dissatisfied with the current state of affairs in my life. I need some positive change. What am I going to do? And only you can answer that. Thanks for listening.